century, Catholics committed an unprecedented mass murder of Orthodox believers. 750,000 Orthodox were brutally murdered by the Catholic fascists in Croatia, with the knowledge and tacit approval of the Pope in Rome, then Pope Pius XII. And how is it today? Even today, in the respective reference books, the members of other denominations are still considered candidates for hell if they don't change their club membership before their death. Even today, military chaplains of various garbs accompany the soldiers of various denominations and religions on their war deployments around the globe. So-called Christian politicians in their countries, including and especially in Germany, produce a large part of the weapons with which people kill each other. And these politicians then go to church on Sunday and display their alleged Christianity. After all, there are just wars, says the priest or pastor. It's merely a question of definition. You just have to lie in the right way, as the scribes have been demonstrating for thousands of years.
But it is not only about the force of arms, the guns, bombs, and cannons. There is also the structural force of oppression, the exploitation of the poor, slavery, feudalism, and global colonialism. From these two, suffering, lack of peace, and conflict still arise to this day. And it is precisely the religions, especially the church-related ones, which abuse the name of the Prince of Peace, Christ, that have a considerable share in this. So when Archbishop Mark says that religion may not be misused against people or to retain power, that's exactly what his own church has done for centuries. In the vast majority of these conflicts, the churches have been and still are on the side. Meanwhile, the filthy rich churches have their social facilities such as kindergartens, hospitals, and retirement homes paid nearly 100% by the state. However, they usually leave untouched their extensive real estate, their land holdings, and their stock portfolios. And so, yet again, they are on the side of the rich. And the gap between rich and poor, particularly in Germany, is one of the largest in Europe. And it is, without doubt, one of the causes for the social unrest in the country.
So lack of peace has many faces and many sources. One of them is the psychological violence among people as well, the manipulation and intimidation that creates dependencies. And here, particularly, the churches are absolute experts. God, the free spirit, is the absolute freedom and love. But for more than 1,000 years, the church cassock wearers have been spreading their infernal doctrine of a supposedly eternal damnation and intimidating people with it. They are supposed to believe and do exactly what the religious functionaries demand of them, and even pay for it as well. The external power of the church representatives has indeed diminished today, but the dogmas of the supposedly eternal hell, which God, the Eternal, never established, are still written in black and white in a catechism and doctrinal writings, and still influence countless people, so that they do not dare contradict the church representatives. Many are still afraid of dying, even if they have long since left the church, because in the back of their minds they still have the fear of an alleged hell. How much suffering and lack of freedom do the cassock wearers cause in the hearts and souls of countless people just because of that? And until today, the politicians, most of all, do not dare to even touch the annual billions of euro subsidies of the state to the quasi-state churches. Why is that?
Dear viewers, dear listeners, we have not yet mentioned a very important area that apparently played hardly any role at the peace talks in Augsburg, at least as far as the press can tell. It is the peace, or rather the lack of peace of humankind toward nature and animals. The cassock wearers of various denominations apparently speak solemnly about peace and reconciliation, and at the same time, humankind's war against nature and the animals continues to rage outside, and it is escalating into a climate disaster of which the religious functionaries in particular have a very considerable share. How can peace and reconciliation between people be lasting if the behavior of people toward nature is not also questioned and changed? It is well known that the consumption of meat, with all its accompanying symptoms, is one of the main causes of global warming. But the annual church holidays such as Christmas and Easter are still the biggest slaughter feasts of the year, as if climate change were nobody's business. In their collections of dogmas and their catechisms, the scribes of our day still allow all the faithful to treat animals as mere objects, to let them vegetate in agonizing mass confinement and brutally slaughter them. The landscape is poisoned and over-fertilized, soil life is compressed, air and water are polluted by animal excrement and artificial fertilizers. Yet, for well over 1,000 years, nature has been less than secondary for the institutional managers of religion. The only thing that is important to them is the well-being and retention of power of their cassock religion.
So what really lies in the DNA of religions? It cannot be the peace that Jesus the Christ, the co-regent of the eternal kingdom, entrusted to us. For centuries, especially in Europe, the cassock wearers dominated people's thinking and speaking almost single-handedly. Anything that diverged from this was severely punished and persecuted, and often enough threatened with torture and burning at the stake. Why then, after 1,500 years, is there a greater lack of peace and more chaos in the world than ever before? In any case, God, the eternal, the free spirit of infinity, never founded a religion, nor did he appoint any of the countless cassock wearers who today abuse his eternal name and that of his Son. God, the All-One, does not talk hypocritically about peace like they do. He is the peace, and this peace grows in the heart of every person who turns to him, the giver of all life, in his life and actions.
On to our next report. On January 21, 2020, a court hearing was held in Germany at the Naumburg Higher Regional Court to determine whether an obscene stone relief sculpture on the Protestant Lutheran Church in Wittenberg should be removed. The relief shows a Jewish rabbi lifting the tail of a pig and looking at its anus. At the same time, people wearing pointed hats, which are supposed to represent Jews, are sucking the animal's teats. This and similar smut, reliefs with which the Jews were mocked in Germany, can still be found in Germany on various church buildings. For example, on the Cologne Cathedral, Nuremberg's Sebaldus Church, the Regensburg Cathedral, the Erfurt Cathedral in Magdeburg, a total of about 30 places in Germany, the worst kind of incitement against Jewish fellow citizens. An elderly Jewish citizen has demanded the removal of this racist smut on the church in Wittenberg. Because the Lutheran Church refuses to do so, the affected citizen took legal action, and in the first instance the case was dismissed before the Regional Court of Dessau-Roßlau. In the hearing of the second instance, the presiding judge indicated that he would also dismiss the complaint. The plaintiff announced that, if the appeal is allowed, he would like to continue with his case and, if necessary, go all the way to the European Court of Justice. However, the plaintiff has already achieved more than he could ever have gained with a successful judgment in the first instance. With the duration of the proceedings and the sensation this trial is causing, more and more people are being confronted with Martin Luther's racist and misanthropic attitude and ask themselves why his successors want, by all means, to hold on to the tradition of vile symbols of hatred and incitement against fellow Jewish citizens. Even if one knew nothing at all about the Lutheran Church's part in the persecution and mass murder of millions of Jews, what ethically and morally honest citizens would voluntarily desecrate his house with the smut of such abysmal meanness and ugliness as that of the Lutheran Church in Wittenberg? And who would not remove such smut as quickly as possible if he had inherited a house from an ancestor with such an eyesore? What decent citizen would not be deeply ashamed if he were constantly associated with the unspeakable crimes of those behind this mark of shame? This applies to every decent citizen and every normal house. But in Wittenberg, this eyesore additionally adorns a building that the Lutheran Church denotes as House of God. Thus, a house in which, according to the Lutheran faith, the God of the Lutheran Church lives. Are there lower standards of ethics and morals for the house of the Lutheran God than for decent citizens? And what about our liberal democratic constitution and the human rights that prohibit such racist excesses? Don't they apply in the area of influence of the Lutheran Church either? And above all, what kind of God is this God of the Lutherans who is supposed to reside in stone houses with this kind of obscene smut? Questions after questions.
Among other things, the Church justifies its refusal to remove the racist sculpture by the fact that it presents the historical context with some plaques of explanation. But here, one rightly asks oneself, in order to remember crimes committed by the Lutheran Church, is it necessary to demonstrate them anew each day? And for this, to display the smut again every day? What criminal would be believed of having repented of his crimes if he commits them again each day, and only now with an explanation of regret? And more questions follow. It was in the church in Wittenberg that Martin Luther's career began 500 years ago, which later led to the separation of his church from the mother church in Rome. At that time, the smutty symbol was already attached to the church in Wittenberg. With his thesis, did Luther also distance himself from the church in Rome in this respect? On the contrary, Luther was one of the worst agitators against his Jewish fellow citizens, and one might even think that the abusive relief in Wittenberg would have inspired him to one of his most vulgar defamations, which also copiously flowed from his pen. We do not want to repeat Luther's fecal language here, so as not to provide a posthumous forum for Martin Luther's sermons of hate, and not to enable him and his followers to again triumph over decency and morality and human dignity. Anyone who wants to know more about the hate preacher Luther can read his accusations in his own writings in the digital media. For example, in his pamphlet on the Jews and their lies. Luther was not only the worst agitator against the Jews, he also agitated against peasants, Turks, against women, against all those who did not want to subordinate themselves to the faith of Martin Luther, and at that time also against the Pope, whom Martin Luther denoted the devil. Many who did not suit him should be handed over to the executioner. Luther himself confessed to incitement to murder and manslaughter and blamed his God who had commanded him to do so. And Luther himself still experienced how the hate sermons and his brutal doctrine of annihilation were put into practice, which then led to murderous acts by Lutherans over the centuries, in religious wars, in the witch mania, in the Lutheran Inquisition, in the colonization of Africa and North America, in the extermination of the Indians in North America, and the indigenous inhabitants of other countries, and everywhere where Lutheran pastors still bless weapons and send people to war to murder other people.
Again and again, and until today, Martin Luther has found successors who, just as unscrupulously as he, put his murderous calls to action in practice within the framework of political possibilities. About 80 years ago, it was Lutheran bishops, such as the Bishop of Thuringia, Martin Sasse, who contributed to the fact that the National Socialists, making reference to Martin Luther, implemented his hate sermons against the Jews with brutal consequences, at first with the fires of the so-called Crystal Night, and later with mass murder. The worst agitators and criminals, such as the editor of the hate magazine Der Stürmer, a weekly Nazi newspaper, Julius Streicher, made reference to Martin Luther's hate speeches before the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal to justify their brutal crimes. Martin Luther is still highly regarded by his representatives to this day. Even today, 500 years later, his spirit still wafts mightily in the headquarters of the second most powerful church concern that has grown since seceding from the Church of Rome. The call for the hangman or the eradication of entire ethnic groups may not currently be the order of the day, since the two dogmatically, strictly hostile state-church concerns have come to terms in Germany with each other and, together, thus have the state under even tighter control, which has paid off equally for both of them. They are the mightiest and richest syndicates with unimaginable multi-billions in assets and immense land holdings. Presently, murder as a means of pastoral care is not opportune, notwithstanding the admonishing words of the well-known philosopher Karl Jaspers. The biblically founded claim to exclusivity of the Church is constantly on the verge of reigniting anew the pyres for heretics. Today's hate preachers have to therefore settle for character assassination and the destruction of livelihoods if they want to silence respectable citizens who may even rebel against the churches. But apart from that, today's church protagonists of education and incitement in habitus, appearance, and mendacious demeanor also faithfully fill out the footprints of their master Luther and their predecessors of the last 500 years. They also call themselves pastors, and, totally in the hypocritical manner of the Inquisition, describe their incitement as pastoral care. They call themselves sect experts, a term that is made up of a clerical term of slander and the proud self-expression of special abilities in this field. True to tradition, they preach hatred against children, women, and men, in order to deprive families of their livelihood and to silence the people. When the whipped-up crowd, incited by racist slogans,
then bellowed, "String them up, put them up against the wall," the Lutheran pastor is not yet satisfied. He admits that the word Inquisition is on target with him, and he expresses his regret that, in the Middle Ages, we would have treated you quite differently. Pastor Hack, from whom these words originate, and after him, Pastor Bink, and whoever their successors were and are, they do the work for the bishops, which one of them once described as dirty work, while the bishops try to keep up appearances with nice speeches and enjoy a luxurious life at the expense of the taxpayers. But appearances are crumbling more and more, not only because, as now in Wittenberg, the true face of Martin Luther, of his teachings and of his church is becoming known, but also because more and more of the crimes of the Lutheran Church of the past are becoming public knowledge. First, the hundreds of thousands of abuses of children in the homes run by the Church. Now, increasingly, also the crimes of child molesters by Protestant functionaries, as in the Oldenwald School or last year in Würzburg.
Dear viewers, dear listeners, you have surely noticed that when Luther or his like-minded friends are mentioned, the name of God, the Eternal, and of His Son, the Christ of God, is not mentioned. This is also logical, because neither Martin Luther nor his teachings and his church have anything to do with God, the Eternal, or His Son, the Christ of God. In this respect, the Lutheran split-off is not different from its mother, the Church of Rome. Nor do they differ in their religious orientation toward a cult of priests with the doctrine of a wrathful, vengeful idol of hell and eternal damnation, founded by priests in times of paganism. Accordingly, they both also reject the eternal law of the eternal, all-one God of love and wisdom, and of His Son, the Christ of God, which the prophets of God of all times taught the people up to the present day. Priests and pastors relegate the law of love for God and neighbor as it is passed down in the 10 Commandments of God through God's prophet Moses and in the Sermon on the Mount of Jesus of Nazareth to the realm of utopia. And they deny the laws of nature, such as the law of cause and effect. Instead, they both pray to a wrathful God of vengeance, who sends His own children to hell or to eternal damnation. And they, therefore, both wrongly use the name Christian, because Christ did not teach and live such things. Christ never founded a church. He never appointed priests or scribes, the theologians of today. Both are a millennia-old pagan tradition. And in this common pagan tradition, the priestmen of both church sections also slander and persecute all the prophets of God of all times. They falsify the revealed Word of God, and in the past they have always, first and foremost, murdered the bearers of the Word from the eternal kingdom, mostly by means of the servile state power. What also links the priestmen of both sections is the obvious lie that the Jews murdered Jesus of Nazareth. The opposite is proclaimed by both cults of priests in their own writings. The Jew, Jesus of Nazareth, was murdered at the instigation of the caste of priests, not of the people, namely by the Roman occupying power, which was under the control of the Pontifex Maximus in Rome at that time, the emperor, who was also the high priest of all pagan religions. Why do you think the present-day high priest in Rome also calls himself Pontifex Maximus? And why, until today, does he still carry at public ceremonial events a particularly ugly sculpture of the cruelly murdered Jesus of Nazareth as the symbol of his power? And here the circle closes to the smut on the Lutheran Church in Wittenberg, and perhaps also makes it understandable why the Lutheran Church does not want to do without this smut. One has the impression that the priests are of the opinion that they cannot do without the smut in Wittenberg and other places, because they still need the Jews as scapegoats in order to divert attention from the fact that the assassination of Jesus of Nazareth goes on the account of the caste of priests whose descendants of descendants abuse the name of Christ today, also in Wittenberg, for their doctrine of hell and eternal damnation, and against a life out of God and Christ. Together with the help of the state powers that are servile to them, both church sections have managed not only to leave a broad trail of blood of annihilation in history, but also with the orientation towards their credo of ruthless exploitation, oppression, violence, and immorality to lead the world into the abyss, into climate change, which has now become a climate disaster, in which all the causes that have been set are now coming into effect.
From the spirit or unspirit of Martin Luther, we now come, as announced, to the so-called spirit of the times. In January 2020, in the Cologne Cathedral, Cardinal Volki warned the Vatican Church against adapting to the spirit of the times. The Church has namely lost its orientation. A many-voiced choir of opinions, personal views, and interests is currently trying to relativize the revelation of God in the faith of the Church and adapt it to the times. As the Catholic News Agency reported on the Archbishop's sermon, it went on to say, only the faith as founded by the apostles and preserved through the ages can guarantee that we are not taken in by will-o'-the-wisp and led astray by them. In reality, it is the Cardinal himself who's trying here, once again, to mislead the people who are listening to him. For he mentions the revelation of God and the faith of the Church here in one breath, as if they were the same thing, but the one has absolutely nothing to do with the other. The revelation of God has never had anything to do with the impenetrable undergrowth of dogmas and doctrines that the religious functionaries call their faith. The prophets of God of all times have always proclaimed a God of love, who radiates through all being, who also dwells with his power in every ensouled human being, and who has brought into being neither an eternal hell nor a church of priests. That is why the prophets of God have always spoken against the caste of priests of their respective times, against the priests who, to this day, intimidate their fellow human beings with a false doctrine of an allegedly punishing God in order to shackle them to their dogmas and rituals. And that is why the priestmen have slandered and persecuted the prophets of God, above all Jesus of Nazareth, and all upright men and women who stood up for them, and had many of them cruelly murdered by their minions in the state.
The priestly church, which Christ, the co-regent of the eternal kingdom, never founded, has thus not preserved his teaching of peace, as Volki claims, but, on the contrary, has replaced it with a many-voiced choir of belligerent and selfish views and interests, which have led humankind through a sea of blood and tears right into today's climate disaster. So it was the cassock wearers of the ecclesiastical religious conglomerates themselves who for centuries shaped and cultivated the so-called spirit of the times. And until today they have lived well from it, always at the expense of the people. To contradict their spirit of the times was life-endangering for centuries. Torture and death on the pyre were the threat. But today, as the cassock wearers' iron grip on people's minds gradually weakens, they complain about the so-called spirit of the times, because at some point it could also put their privileges and extensive state subsidies to the test.
Of course, the spirit of the times produces very different things today, but it is precisely from this that one can often see that the ecclesiastical spirit of the times of the past is still having an effect. It has not given people any orientation in the spirit of cosmic truth, as the prophets of God have always taught. Scientists, for example, have unleashed the atomic forces, but the church institutions have not opposed that, not even the nuclear armament. On the contrary, the popes have even welcomed it. They also hardly object to the manipulation of the genes, and they also welcome, for example, organ transplants, which shows that the religious functionaries hardly know anything about the meaning of life, about the soul's ability to perceive and feel pain during the dying process, or about the soul's continued life after death. Otherwise, they would not condone the scientific brain-dead dogma, which was specially established to justify such operations. So, if it were expedient, in the spirit of a higher ethics and morality of the Sermon on the Mount, then it is precisely the churches that do not contradict the so-called spirit of the times, but make mutual cause with it. From this alone, we can easily recognize what sort of people they, in reality, are. Dear viewers, dear listeners, with this we come to the end of our report. We wish you all the best for the coming week. Goodbye, and greetings in God.
Liebe Zuschauerinnen, liebe Zuschauer.
Dear viewers, dear listeners, welcome to our subject, Religious War in a Christian Country. The present time brings much to think about for you and for all of us, so follow our thoughts with us. Recently, in Europe, reports about outbursts of violence and mutual threats for reasons of religion have been accumulating, also from refugee shelters, among other places. In one city, a house for refugees was ravaged and police were injured. The reason? A resident there had torn several pages out of a Koran and thrown them away. In another city, there was a mass brawl between Christians, Jews and Muslims in such a shelter. Ever more often, it comes to threats of murder for religious reasons. For example, threats of decapitation by Sunnites against Shiites. This is reported by Max Klingberg of the International Society for Human Rights. Above all, Yazidis and Oriental Christians are threatened. Is this a religious war in a Christian country? In a country whose society is shaped by a religion that calls itself Christian? The chairman of the German police union, Rainer Wendt, informs about the various forms of Salafists in Germany. To this branch of religion also belong so-called militant jihadists who see themselves in an alleged holy war against dissidents, and who have also recruited refugees. The increasing reports of violence are only the tip of the iceberg, stated Simon Jacob of the Central Council of Oriental Christians. The estimated number of unreported cases is very high. Literally, we must reckon with further conflicts between Christians and Muslims, between Shiites and Sunnites, between Kurds and extremists, between Yazidis and extremists. Religious war in a Christian country? Considering the conflict between various religions, we understand ever better why Jesus of Nazareth did not found any external religion. We frequently observe that external religions practice coercion, but Christ is freedom. That is why he is the free spirit. He has nothing at all to do with the institutional so-called Christianity of the churches. Jesus of Nazareth, the free spirit, taught us the inner religion. He said, "Follow me," that is, the free spirit, not external religions, their priests or clan leaders. The inner religion links people of all cultures in mutual respect, in goodwill and in peace among one another, which leaves each one his freedom. As is clearly demonstrated to us in our time, external religions lead to separations, dependencies, and the dominion of leaders of religions or clans over their faithful. They are the opium for the people. The chairman of the police union also complains of hardcore criminal structures in the newly developed refugee shelters. Various clans fight to be able to push through their religious rules and regulations there. The police spokesman reports, and I quote, "We've been experiencing this violence for weeks and months. Groups come together according to ethnic groups, according to religious or clan structures, and go after each other with knives and homemade weapons. And so, is there a religious war in a Christian country? In the quarters of asylum seekers, some violence is traced back to crowdedness and the tense situation, but religion is also decisive. Therefore, as precaution, from the ranks of the police, demands have also been made to place refugees in the respective facilities according to religion. That would ease the situation for the police. But the vice-chairman of the police union, Georg Radek, also warned the ethnic and religious conflicts that the refugees bring with them from their home countries could soon also find their way into the daily life of our cities. There, activities of certain groups in the name of their religion have already led to increased police operations. So what else is coming to us here? A religious war that spreads out in a country that calls itself Christian? Who bears the responsibility for this? In his speech before the U.S. Congress in September 2015, Pope Francis pointed out about religions. I quote, "Our world is increasingly a place of violent conflict, hatred, and brutal atrocities, committed even in the name of God and of religion. We know that no religion is immune from forms of individual delusion or ideological extremism." End of quote. With this, doesn't the Pope also confirm that especially external religions and their respective gods were and are breeding grounds for warlike actions again and again? What about Jesus of Nazareth? Did he ever condone war? If not, who abused him for such purposes? It was the religion of the Pope who, under the false label Christian, carried war into the Arabian countries during the Crusades. Thereby, however, the religious warriors were not following Christ. the Prince of Peace, but the summons of the respective popes. And it was representatives of the papal religion who, with the overthrow of governments, promotion of insurrections and export of weapons, helped to ignite outbreaks of violence and counter-violence. Here, as orientation, the canonized Pope John Paul II is recommended, who, at the beginning of the 1990s, during the Balkan War, stated, "We are not pacifists." Now, in our time, many warriors from Arabian countries are, in the name of their religion, presently seeking revenge against the religion of the Crusaders. So external religions fought and fight against each other. They believe that their God is the right one, and from this they take a claim to power and enforced belief. Conclusion: original Christians are against external religions. Did Jesus of Nazareth order a claim to power and enforced beliefs? Can this be found in the reports about Jesus? If not, from whom does it then come? Following the Second World War, a good constitution was established in the Republic of Germany, in which freedom of religion and conscience is anchored. In the Frankfurter Allgemeinen Zeitung from September 2015, it clearly and explicitly states about this: in Germany, the Constitution is above the Bible and the Koran. Doesn't that mean that neither the Vatican Church, nor the Luther Church, nor Islam, or any other external religion or other, should be raised to be the standard in the state, to say nothing of financing it with billions of tax monies? In our time, the government in Germany calls itself Christian. At the same time, weapons are being produced and exported on a large scale, so that Germany is the fourth biggest exporter of arms worldwide. Isn't it true that many people become refugees only due to the conflicts that are carried out with these weapons? And then one shows oneself to be big-hearted. And when the President of the Federal Republic of Germany says, "Germans have a big heart, but the limit of capacity has been reached," then the question arises, where is the big heart in the fourth biggest arms exporter? Ever more people are now fleeing from countries where the weapons are being used into those countries where they are produced. And when politicians condone the production and export of weapons, why then do they call themselves Christian? Did Jesus order us to resort to weapons in certain situations? Is that written anywhere? And if not, from whom does it come then? Is not the export of weapons with the agreement of allegedly Christian political parties an abuse and mockery of the good name of Christ? Jesus the Christ admonished, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who take up the sword will perish by the sword." Jesus of Nazareth also said, "Love your enemies," which doesn't mean love the one who kills others just as he is. Instead, love the soul being, the inner being of this person. Many people practice atrocities in the name of the God of their religion. With this, they also darken the core of being and the divine spark in their own soul, about which Jesus of Nazareth taught, "The kingdom of God is within, in you." External religions believe that their God is the right one. With this claim to power, they go against one another. What if there were no external religion at all? If reconciliation would be above everything, the love for God and neighbor, as Jesus of Nazareth lived it as an example? Jesus of Nazareth never founded a religion. Instead, he taught the inner religion. Christ is freedom. This is why he is the free spirit. He did not say, "Follow an external religion," but "Follow me, the free spirit." Christ is freedom, and therefore the following also applies. May the one who can grasp it, grasp it. May the one who wants to leave it, leave it. Dear viewers, dear listeners, for me, as an original Christian, it is a form of grace not to have to follow a god of a religion who calls for or justifies war against those who believe differently. The four great prophets, Abraham, Moses, Elijah, and Isaiah in particular, brought us the one God of love, who stands above all religions. In spirit, they are also law beings who personify the basic powers of God: order, will, wisdom, and earnestness. In conclusion, one more thought. Each person, the one more, the other less, feels unhappy now and then. It is similar for us original Christians. But one thing makes me happy. That is the experience of the one God, the God of love for God and neighbor, of whom Jesus of Nazareth taught us. The free, all one God, who stands above all religions and denominations. In this spirit, I take my leave of you, in the free spirit of the Christ of God. Goodbye.
Liebe Zuschauerinnen, liebe Zuschauer, herzlich willkommen.
Dear viewers, dear listeners, welcome. In mid-May 2018, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel was awarded the Lamp of Peace in Assisi, which was presented to her by the Order of the Franciscans. This lamp is a copy of the oil lamp that permanently burns on the grave of Francis of Assisi, whom the Vatican Church calls a saint. With it, Angela Merkel is supposed to be honored for her efforts toward the reconciliation and peaceful coexistence between peoples, above all within the framework of the European Union, according to a speaker of the order. But the prize was also for her decision to open the borders during the refugee crisis of 2015, according to the German newspaper Die Welt. The Vatican's news page also took the opportunity of this award ceremony following the prayer of the Holy Francis, "Make me an instrument of peace," to extensively quote from the instructive articles by Pope Francis, who spoke there of attentiveness toward the weak, of an authentically lived holistic ecology, and praised St. Francis. For him, every creature was a sister and a brother.
At first impression, all that sounds very harmonious. We could also say that the mighty of the world like to mutually praise each other, and the media likes to applaud. It goes over well in the salons. But what does the reality look like? What would the lamp of peace, which Mrs. Merkel promised to place on her desk, tell us if it could talk? Let's start with the topic war and peace. The European Union, and in particular Germany, are some of the largest producers and exporters of weapons worldwide. And they deliver these weapons, despite all assurances to the contrary, even to crisis areas. So German and European weapons are used to shoot, injure, and murder people in civil war countries like Syria or Yemen. How does this fit with its C for Christian in the name of the governing party, to which the Chancellor also belongs? Jesus, the Christ, lived nonviolence. He was a pacifist, and now, in his name, politicians are authorizing the export of death-bringing weapons to crisis countries, where they then increase the suffering and despair and drive people into flight.
And with that, we've reached another topic, the so-called refugee crisis. Arms exports are only one of the so-called causes of flight, of which there is a lot of talk in general, but which politicians usually hardly name specifically, let alone really address. What is driving people around the world to flee? It is, for example, the fishing fleets of the European Union that are emptying the seas off Africa's coasts. It is the European Union's agricultural subsidies that artificially reduce the price of food, which then land on African markets and deprive African suppliers of a chance to sell locally produced food. It is so-called free trade agreements that force these states not to defend themselves against these imports. And then, for decades, authoritarian rulers and dictators have been paid to keep people in their own countries by force. European money also flows to Libya, where people are enslaved and tortured just because they are desperately passing through. And this policy of isolation at all costs began long before 2015, when the valve was briefly opened at one point because it was apparently no longer possible to do otherwise.
And then the Pope, with the help of his media department, wants to jump on the bandwagon of this award ceremony and thereby have references made to his alleged merits for ecological awareness. Yet, in his pronouncements until today, animals have not been mentioned even once and are not, even by so-called Christians, regarded as creatures of God, let alone as brothers or sisters, but are cruelly tortured and brutally slaughtered all over the world because people want to satisfy the lust of their palate. Is this the peace with nature that Francis of Assisi wanted, which Jesus of Nazareth also entrusted to us human beings, and which the first Christians aspired to by respecting nature and not eating animals? Francis of Assisi certainly did not want to found an ecclesiastical order. After his death, many young members of the order, called spirituals, tried to put his original ideas into practice, but they were persecuted as heretics and burned at the stake. Other members of the order later actively participated in the so-called Inquisition, the cruel persecution of people of other faiths.
Dear viewers, dear listeners, we see that it's worthwhile to critically question even apparently positive reports from the media salons, because in many places there are uncomfortable truths to be discovered, and perhaps then one or the other light will actually light up for us. So let us remain vigilant. Goodbye, and greetings in God.